Thank you. Good morning. I want to echo Mayor Bongat in thanking you for staying on a Friday morning and the last day of Metropolis. I would like to begin by acknowledging the privilege to speak here on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to do so here at International Metropolis. If my presentation had a name, it probably would be called The Increasing Difficulties of Inclusion and Integration. So just bear with me while I throw some stats at you at the top of my presentation. On June 16, 2019, we read in the media that a majority of Canadians polled, approximately 63%, believe the federal government should limit the number of immigrants to the country. The poll was conducted by Leisure between June 7th and 10th. Only 37% of those polled thought that there should be more immigration to meet Canada's economic needs. The respondents were randomly recruited, that's my caveat, so they're probably not a representative random sample of the population, but still the findings are worrying. An earlier poll by the same company in February of this year found that half the respondents believed that Canada welcomes too many immigrants and refugees. But what we found most alarming was the expressed preference for white immigration. An ECOS poll from April found that around 42% of Canadians believe too many non-white people were accepted as immigrants into Canada. Another poll last month had a similar finding, with 37% of those polled saying that they believe non-white immigration was a threat to Canada. Many of us and many Canadians across the country, from coast to coast to coast, believe that if these findings were from the US or Europe, folks wouldn't be too surprised, but not Canada. However, racism, and in particular anti-black racism and Islamophobia, because as we know, Muslims are often constructed as racialized, is alive and well here in the Great North. So the findings of the poll should not be a surprise to us, nor should it be seen as some new Canadian attitude. What was new, as the pollster reported, is that for the first time since it began its tracking in the 1990s, resentment about the growth of immigration was now blended with resentment about the rate of non-white immigration. What is also important to note is that the majority of those holding these views were also partial to the conservative movement. And as I said, up to 70% of those who believed that non-white immigration was a threat to Canada and that Canada was accepting too many non-white immigrants identified as supporters of Canada's federal Conservative Party. These hardening attitudes are deeply troubling on many levels, not the least that we are heading into a federal election in a couple of months. A couple of weeks ago, after a marathon debate on Sunday, June 16th, the Quebec government pushed through Bill 21, the so-called secularism law. The law bars service employees such as teachers, police officers, judges, and others from wearing religious symbols such as crucifixes, kippas, turbans, hijabs, and niqabs in the course of their duties. The bill took a harder line on a previous government measure by a previous Liberal government in Quebec that residents are required to uncover their faces when accessing public services such as public transit and the legal system. And along with Bill 21, the Quebec government announced it will establish surveillance and disciplinary mechanisms to ensure the bill is respected. The bill and the enforcement measures have been met with massive public outcry, and different groups continue to protest both. I must say that among the most outspoken protesters are Muslim women, particularly Muslim women of color, who are hijabis. And if there was ever any question about whether or not they were socially integrated into Quebec and Canadian society, their active participation in organizing and speaking out against the bill should convince anyone otherwise. Through their actions, they have demonstrated that they are aware, engaged, and will not hesitate to speak out against injustice and for their human rights. The Quebec government's version of social integration is one of forced secularism, one that comes complete with enforcement mechanisms. It is also one of religious and racial intolerance, since Muslim women are disproportionately affected and they are also predominantly women of color. I often say that Islamophobia is fought on the bodies of Muslim women. Groups like Justice Femme are bearing witness. They are documenting and reporting out the increase that they are seeing in the experiences of violence against Muslim women and Muslim women who are visibly Muslim. It was really sad then that when the Premier of Quebec, in an interview a couple of days ago, were asked to comment on the fact that Bill 21 was resulting in these increased Islamophobic attacks, he said that he did not really believe that that was happening. It was only 2.5 years ago that Quebec Muslims were subjected to a terror attack, a mass shooting at the Quebec City Mosque that left 6 worshippers killed and 19 others injured. There are connections here. But moving on from Quebec. Canada generally prides itself on acknowledging that integration is a two-way process where individuals and groups can be full participants in Canadian society while retaining their own cultural identity, unlike, say, the United States, which uses language of assimilation. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act states as its objective, and I quote, to promote the successful integration of permanent residents into Canada while recognizing that integration involves mutual obligations for new immigrants and Canadian society, end of quote. To facilitate the process, the federal government and some subnational governments, as certainly here in Ontario, invest significantly, especially at the federal level, in settlement services, including free language trainings to support new arrivals, or at the least the sanctioned ones, those we invite in to settle and integrate. The support is helped along by rules that mandate fluency in one of the 2 official languages in order to gain residency or citizenship, the steel in the velvet glove, as we say at Okasi. Yes, integration is a two-way process, but done our way. The Department of Canadian Heritage, which is tasked with the implementation of the Multiculturalism Act, sees its role as promoting and celebrating an inclusive society. And yesterday we celebrated Multicultural Day here in Canada. But as those using a critical analysis have pointed out, Canada's discourse on immigration and multiculturalism is one of compliance and conformity. That ultimately it is an exhortation to become more like us without quite defining the us. And in case I'm not being clear on where I stand, this exhortation to become more like us are neither possible, as my people who've been here for 7 generations will tell you, nor even desirable. Witness the invoking of Canadian culture and Canadian values, whatever that might be, by certain media organizations and certain politicians from time to time over the last several decades, or even over the last couple of days. It's used to demonize people of color, to express thinly veiled racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia. Just this morning, I was reading, as you will know, the Federal Department of Canadian Heritage released its long-awaited anti-racism strategy a couple of days ago. And the immediate response from one of our national party leaders is dog whistling around Islam and Muslims. This leader talked about, okay, they tried to push through Motion 103, and for those of you not from Canada, Motion 103 was a non-binding, feel-good statement that basically says Canada is against Islamophobia and other forms of hate. That was seeking unanimous consent in our parliament. And this national leader says, first they gave us M103, and now comes the strategy. Are you concerned about Sharia? how that leap is made, this is what dog whistling is about. If social integration is intended to leave everyone with a sense of belonging and a full participant in society, we can clearly see that it is not playing out so well even over several generations. We know that economic integration is a critical factor in achieving social integration. The United Way of Greater Toronto reflected in a recent report, Rebalancing the Opportunity Equation, that and I quote, our social foundations are weakened when the opportunity equation is compromised. The report examined census data for the City of Toronto and spoke of the widening and deepening of income inequality along racial and gender lines, confirming what many of us have been talking about for the last 2 decades and more, that the intersections of racial and ethnic identity and gender are more likely to determine opportunity rather than the attainment of education, skills, or credentials. So I sometimes ask, as I do this work, is the idea of social integration even attainable? And I would like to think, yes, it is. Various municipal governments in Canada have also been asking that question and asking, how is it? What role do we have to play as municipal governments? What relationships do we have to develop with civil society organizations? How do we bring the other levels of government to the table? Cities can certainly look at themselves as corporations and put into place, as some have done, measures like employment equity and privilege those who have historically been excluded when they hire. They can give priorities to those who are most disadvantaged in their particular jurisdiction. They can explore using mechanisms such as paid internships and mentorships of immigrants, contract compliance with their vendors so that they're only contracting with vendors whose workforce resembles the city and the sites where they're located. One good example of this in Toronto is the Toronto Community Benefits Network, who is working very closely with city government as well as with labor to ensure that as the city invests billions of dollars in infrastructure, that apprenticeships and management positions and training is made available for racialized and indigenous young people in our communities and for women, so that women themselves are becoming involved in non-traditional trades, and that includes racialized immigrant and refugee women. There are also other opportunities where we've seen cities be proactively engaged in facilitating social, economic, and political integration. For example, we saw the City of Toronto take the lead in adopting a motion to allow immigrants, permanent residents specifically, to be able to participate in municipal elections, something that is already done in many places around the world. Thus, as I said, the City of Toronto was the first municipality in Canada to pass that motion, and in Ontario, it was quickly followed by North Bay, which is one of our small northern cities, and the City of Hamilton. And across Canada, Vancouver on our west coast and Calgary in the prairies also adopted the motion, and I know I'm quickly running out of time. Civil society organizations like OCASI and our member agencies have engaged with other municipalities where possible to encourage the adoption of a similar motion. A promising movement emerged a few years ago, but unfortunately seemed to have lost momentum. Let me jump to my conclusion with my last 90 seconds, and then I'm going to take an extra minute to show you something. That along with these very concrete, hard, put people to work, pay attention to policies and practices at the municipal level, I think cities also have a role to play in public education. And we have worked closely with the City of Toronto, and for my colleagues here who are members of OCASI, it's not that I don't think other cities in the province are not doing anything, but the council is located in the City of Toronto, and we tend to have more interaction with the city. But we've worked very closely with the City of Toronto on issues like access without fear, where municipal services are made accessible to everyone regardless of immigration status. But we've also worked closely with the city on developing public awareness campaign. Our two campaigns that we did with the city in the last couple of years have been focused on anti-Islamophobia, where we did a bus shelter campaign across the city and had pictures of two people, a Muslim woman in a hijab, a white person, and it says, as immigrants often hear, go back to where you come from, and the woman says, where? North York, which is a city, which is a small area in Toronto. We did a number of ads across the province where we had billboards on Highway 401 that talked about what do you call a Muslim woman flying an airplane? And what do you think the answer is? What do you call a Muslim woman flying an airplane? Progress. Thank you. So, and it sparked conversation. But I think what got the most play and what was incredibly important for us were two ads that we did. And this is really good example of public-private CSO, civil society organization partnership, where we worked pro bono with a communications firm along with the City of Toronto to develop these two ads that I want to leave you with. Please cue the US.